In 1978, Halloween became one of the most financially successful low-budget films ever made, and ushered in a new era in which horror films were suddenly everywhere. Though Halloween was frequently imitated, it took several years before a sequel was finally put into production, due in large part to the fact that John Carpenter didn't actually want to make a Halloween Part 2. Picking up just as Part 1 ends, Halloween 2 flows smoothly on from the events of the first film, and uses a lot of the same creative team, with a few notable exceptions, foremost amongst them being Rick Rosenthal as director, replacing John Carpenter. The end result is a film about Michael Myers, or The Shape, stalking Laurie Strode through a hospital during the latter half of the same Halloween night upon which the events of the first movie took place, a sequel in the truest sense. Generally regarded as being one of the best films in the series, mainly because it feels so similar in tone to the original, Halloween 2 is a film that faced a lot of difficulties during its production, and one that, for the most part, was not held in anything like the same esteem as its progenitor when it was initially released, and famously was all but disowned by John Carpenter himself. In a 1984 interview to promote perhaps his most mainstream movie to date, the sci-fi romance Starman, John Carpenter spoke out about his feelings on the film, sentiments which, for the most part, he seems to stand by to this day.
It doesn't always work. I thought Halloween 3 was excellent. I really like that film because it's different. It has a real nice feel to it. I think he's a talented director. On the other hand, I think Halloween 2 is an abomination and a horrible movie. I was really disappointed in it. But I don't think the director has gone on and done some other films. I think his career is launched now. But I don't think he had a feel for the material. I think that's the problem. He didn't have a feeling for what was going on.
And that is vital.
Oh, yeah.
Bear in mind, however, that this was at a point when it seemed that after the Michael Myers-less Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, the Halloween franchise appeared to have been killed off for good, rather than being the ongoing affair that it would become just a few years later. This explains some of Carpenter's unusual frankness in his condemnation of a movie that he himself was responsible for writing. So why was Halloween 2 so disliked upon its release, and why has it slowly over the years gone on to become a fan favourite? Is John Carpenter right? Are the fans? Or is there more to this whole business than meets the eye? To understand Halloween 2 better, we need to consider what making a sequel entailed in 1981, the ongoing tension between film critics and horror films in general, and most important of all, to put ourselves in John Carpenter's shoes and to try and understand what led him to dismiss Halloween 2 so publicly, so we can decide whether or not he actually has a point. Halloween was, as we all know, a gigantic financial success, and John Carpenter was keen to use it as a springboard to bigger things. He was a hot commodity and could make basically whatever film he wanted to, because Irwin Yablans, producer of Halloween, was so pleased with the results of their collaboration. Being a money man, Yablans was eager to usher Halloween 2 into production, but Carpenter wanted to make the film that would eventually become The Fog, a much more explicitly supernatural ghost story that played with spooky imagery and atmospheric direction to make its mark. The truth was, Carpenter had no interest in Halloween 2 for a very good reason. There was nothing left to tell of the story. He'd made the film that he'd wanted to and been given complete creative control over the end product, which had been one of the things that he considered vital in even agreeing to make Halloween in the first place. Now he wanted to do something else and was keen not to be pinned down to make a sequel, which Carpenter considered a creatively bankrupt prospect. Carpenter was working on the script for The Fog, which Irwin Yablans had agreed to produce as part of a 2-film deal along with Halloween 2, in order to give Carpenter time to think up a worthy idea for a sequel. However, a fateful encounter with Bob Remy of Avco Embassy Pictures led to Carpenter agreeing to produce The Fog, along with the film that Carpenter actually wanted to make, which would turn out to be 1981's Escape from New York, for Yablans' rival. Irwin Yablans then sued Remy and Carpenter, and finally Carpenter was allowed to honour his commitment to Avco on the proviso that he start work on Halloween 2 immediately afterwards for Yablans. So naturally, Carpenter's enthusiasm for the project was further diminished, which led to what was to become an incredibly strange production of a film that was almost entirely made to keep the producers happy, and offered little for the creative team to get their teeth into, especially in comparison with the first film. And yet Halloween 2 isn't a total train wreck. It has a lot of good things in it, and as far as sequels go, it offers a fairly seamless continuation of the original film with a higher body count, a punched up soundtrack and a larger scale, along with a vital, genuinely shocking revelation at its core. So why was John Carpenter so totally appalled by Halloween 2? There are few sequels made to which the writer expresses such an obvious loathing of his own material. Almost every time John Carpenter discusses Halloween 2, it is with contempt, the majority of which seems to centre on that all-important 11th hour plot twist that declared Michael Myers and Laurie Strode to be siblings, something that Carpenter himself attributes to desperation on his part during one of many late-night writing sessions that might have involved anywhere between some and way too much alcohol. If you've seen more than one Halloween film, chances are you're familiar with this idea because literally every film since it takes this idea and incorporates it into its DNA as a staple of the series. As a result, viewing this film in hindsight is perhaps not as egregious as it must have been when the film was first released. It's easy to compare it to The Empire Strikes Back's big final act plot twist, but nobody's complaining about that. But in 2018, we finally saw it. A Halloween film in which Michael Myers and Laurie Strode categorically are not related, and it was basically a rehash of the original that cherry-picked ideas from the more fondly remembered of the sequels. And you know what? It didn't feel any more or less contrived than any of the sequels in which Laurie and Michael were related.
Wasn't it her brother who murdered all those babysitters?
No, it was not her brother. That's something that people made up.
John Carpenter decided on the siblings' relationship with an air of fuck it, because he was writing Halloween 2 as a contractual obligation, not because he was interested in a new take on the material or in taking the story in a new direction. He saw Michael and Laurie's relationship as the only way to justify having more of the night he came home, even though he basically hated the idea. But it isn't even a significant plot point of Halloween 2. There's almost more time given over to one character's inability to operate a walkie-talkie than there is to the notion that Michael Myers has returned to kill his other sister.
One of you had better drive down to the sheriff's station right away.
Mr. Garrett, how do you work this thing? Mr. Garrett? Mr. Garrett, I gotta get back on the floor. Hello?
It somehow doesn't feel entirely convincing in the way that it's delivered, seeming like perhaps a last-minute addition to the script. The film doesn't grind to a halt to accommodate this revelation, and it doesn't affect what happens in any way. What I'm getting at is this: if you cut out the single passage of dialogue, this 30-second sequence, then the whole film would carry on more or less unchanged. In short, it's strange that John Carpenter set out to ask the question why, when he had made such a point of maintaining ambiguity in the original. If he understood why his own totally uncompromised original film was such a masterpiece, then how could he have fumbled the ball so badly by deliberately contradicting and undermining it with the sequel? Because whatever else its faults, and it certainly has a few, when you're criticising Halloween 2 these days, you're basically criticising the Myers-Strode family thing, and it seems bizarre, given how incidental it is to the mechanism of the film itself, that it's this plot line that overshadows everything else in an otherwise serviceable to thoroughly entertaining slasher film. In its format and execution, Halloween 2 displays the influence of its contemporaries with more explicit and more elaborately staged death scenes, many of which seem superfluous. Halloween was light on gore, but for Halloween 2 to succeed, it had to contend with audiences used to the inventive kill scenes that had propelled Friday the 13th to an unlikely box office success, which we'll get more into later on. That meant that Michael Myers had to be willing to get his hands dirty, but it also came with an unusual side effect: his reduction in status from a mythic embodiment of all evil to a fairly run-of-the-mill peeping Tom for the first hour or so of the film. In fact, of the many post-Halloween films that deliberately tried to copy the formula of Carpenter's film, very few indeed saw beyond the mask, knife and teenagers, and seldom played with the idea that their antagonists were even remotely supernatural. The Michael Myers of Halloween 2 is a far less obviously supernatural entity than he was in the original film in several respects. Rather than building to a big twist in which the shape started as a stalk-and-slash figure before emerging as an unkillable boogeyman, Halloween 2's Michael starts the film off as indestructible evil, which makes makes it harder for us to accept scenes where he's just lurking about, doing not a great deal of anything. For the first 2/3 of the movie, we see way too much of Michael and get little sense of him as the ultimate evil. Instead, he's a far more prosaic character, albeit one possessed of greater ingenuity and stealth than his predecessor, as he swiftly and silently isolates the Haddonfield Memorial Hospital and picks off its staff one by one until he gets to Laurie. However cleverly Michael is scripted though, he just isn't treated with the same care and attention as he was under Carpenter's direction, and he loses some of his mystique along the way, no matter how frequently the Halloween theme is played when he's on screen. He has more big things to do this time around, certainly, but whenever Dick Warlock, replacing the original's Nick Castle as the main Michael Myers suit actor, explicitly copies something from the first film like the headcock, it just doesn't feel right because it doesn't feel earned, and it reminds us we're watching an imitation. Part of this is due to the fact that we have an earthier, more physical Michael this time around, and part of it is because there isn't the same motivation behind Halloween 2, and it's Michael Myers isn't the ultimate figure of terror, but just one of a long line of fearsome knife-wielding killers trying his best to be noticed in the crowd, bereft of his power to scare because he's now just another escaped maniac with family issues, which is where we need to stop and think about what Halloween 2 could have been. I'm totally of the belief that Halloween 2 is a film made by talented filmmakers with a strong cast. What lets it down the most is a script that feels compromised and a director that suffers from being not as good as John Carpenter, which to be fair most people aren't. Yet when it was released, Halloween 2 was near universally derided, only gaining acceptance as a solid sequel in later years. Can it really all be because of those few lines of dialogue that connect Laurie and Michael? So here's the thing. John Carpenter never really wanted to make Halloween 2, but it would be insane to think that he deliberately wrote a shoddy script in the hopes of tanking a potential franchise. Instead, Carpenter more or less agreed to write Halloween 2 on the understanding that doing so would allow him to finally kill off Michael Myers in a definitive and satisfying way that wouldn't leave any room for doubt that the Shape would not be returning if a Halloween 3 ever came into being, which is why the action is so compressed and follows on so immediately from where the first film left off, even though in reality it was several years later. John Carpenter had other ideas initially about an older Laurie Strode either going to college or living in a high-rise building, making for a change of setting for her inevitable reunion with the Shape. However, both these ideas were nixed, perhaps because they had both already been done before. In fact, in the case of the high-rise building scenario, this sounded incredibly similar to Carpenter's own made-for-TV movie of 1978, Someone's Watching Me, and doubtless reviewers would have picked up on this too. With both his initial pitches shot down, it was clear that Carpenter was operating in not just a post-Halloween world of slasher imitators, but a post-Friday the 13th landscape, in which it was necessary to think up a gimmick for your movie to differentiate it from all the others, even though the Halloween brand itself was more than enough of a guarantee of strong box office, given Part 1's killer performance. The gimmick that was settled on in the end was a hospital setting, but more important was the fact that this film took place on the same night as the previous installment. The hospital setting was a natural extension of this, and in hindsight is clearly a lot less contrived than any other potential sequel concept that would have seen the Shape return to stalk Laurie several years after she'd left Haddonfield. But the obvious hook for John Carpenter here was that by making it a continuation of his original film, he was able to control the narrative of his own story by bringing it to a close in a way that didn't leave the door open for future sequels. There was no need to think up a way to bring the Shape back, or Laurie, or Dr. Loomis, because this was the same story as the first film, bringing the cat and mouse tale to a conclusion whilst being careful to avoid establishing a pattern that could be copied for film after film. If events could be twisted to bring Laurie and Michael back together years after the events of Haddonfield 78 in a new setting, then there was nothing to say that it couldn't become a yearly tradition, as the only thing necessary for a Halloween sequel was clearly that it took place largely on Halloween. John Carpenter clearly didn't want to turn his story into something that would happen again and again, so he was keeping contrivance to a minimum whilst pointing out the fallacy of making a sequel that involved the repetition of events from Part 1. Again, if you cut out the 30 to 40 seconds of explanation about Laurie and Michael being related, we never question the Shape's motives in Halloween 2 because we immediately know them to be the same as they were in Part 1, totally mysterious. So you can see, John Carpenter wasn't an idiot. He knew exactly what he was doing. So why did he settle for the family dynamic between his two leads? Beyond total contempt for the concept of this particular sequel, I believe that John Carpenter was making extra sure that no matter how hard they tried, nobody else would be in a position to make a Halloween 3. To do so, he closed the circle of his characters as much as he possibly could, to tie up any loose ends, and to make sure that given that Jamie Lee Curtis was proudly announcing this to be her last horror film, as she put her Scream Queen years behind her, the Shape wouldn't be returning to menace a new group of characters, because unlike the retcon that Carpenter had imposed on his films that gave Michael Myers a motive for his actions, he simply wouldn't have the need to go out killing again. He may have been prone to hacking up people that got in his way, but the Michael Myers of Halloween 2 was a killer with a definite purpose, rather than the omnipresent boogeyman of Part 1, who easily could have returned to menace a new group of characters year after year, Jason Voorhees style, because the Shape was a character that represented an archetypal evil. If this was indeed the case, that given how much John Carpenter hated the idea of making studio-mandated sequels to his own indie classic, then it made sense why the script was predicated upon the return of virtually everyone that survived the end of Part 1 in order to make the story as tight and personal as possible. Whether this was Carpenter's intention or not, Halloween 2 was the film that changed the franchise forever and established the central storyline that would run through the remainder of the sequels for the next 40 years. History is on Halloween 2's side because we are so familiar with its central twist and are able to evaluate it on its own merits as a part of the Halloween series, one of the best, and as an early 80s slasher film, also one of the best. What prompted John Carpenter to declare this particular film an abomination and led future Halloween 3 director Tommy Lee Wallace to decline Carpenter's offer to direct was that it was deemed superfluous and exploitative from an artistic standpoint. As I mentioned in my previous Halloween video, John Carpenter's 1978 masterpiece fought hard for its critical acceptance and eventually emerged as a film that was recognised as significant and worthy of merit by the very same critics that had initially denounced it as trash. The film itself didn't change, but the perception of Halloween was altered to better reflect what Carpenter was setting out to say, as well as in acknowledging the film's immense box office success. In order to better appreciate Halloween 2, though, we need to make certain concessions as well. To avoid falling into the trap of saying that it's a sequel to the film that's objectively better than it, it must be a crappy cash-in. By 1981, horror films had abandoned the oftentimes heavily suggested but bloodless sequences of suffering and emotional torment prevalent in the 1970s, and had begun instead to focus on kills, graphic sequences of crowd-pleasing special effects that would provoke a visceral reaction from audiences. The movie usually credited with starting this trend was Sean S. Cunningham's Friday the 13th, one of the most financially successful of the Halloween imitators. It was also a movie that divided audiences and critics alike, with critics condemning it for its gruesomely staged violence, and audiences liking it for much the same reason. It's easy to forget that for those of us who have spent years watching and enjoying the horror films of the 1970s and especially the 1980s, that what we now think of as slasher films were greeted with near total vitriol from critics at the time. During the first few years of the 1980s, many critics took a stand against the rising trend for on-screen violence in horror films. This was still an ongoing issue when Halloween 2 was released. Looking through the reviews of the time, one thing stands out as a major complaint against Halloween 2, and that was that it wasn't afraid to show violence and bloodshed, unlike its predecessor. To people watching now, though, the violence in Halloween 2 isn't anything remarkable, and there are few majorly graphic set pieces, although it is more explicitly violent than the first movie. The issue here isn't so much that the violence is sadistic or mean-spirited, but rather that in continuing the tone of Halloween Part 1, Halloween 2 makes a conscious effort to display what was deliberately only hinted at in the first film. Whilst a lot of people were keen to suggest that this was because director Rick Rosenthal was unable to rely solely on suspense and the subliminal violence of John Carpenter's movie, so he merely fell back on graphic violence to get a reaction from the audience, it turns out that this wasn't the case at all. When Rick Rosenthal turned in his first cut of Halloween 2 to the producers, it was considered to be severely lacking, and so additional reshoots were required, a reasonably common practice in Hollywood. However, rather than trusting the reshoots to Rosenthal, the studio reached out to John Carpenter himself, who streamlined Rosenthal's film and cut out a lot of extraneous dialogue sequences, leading to several narrative gaps in the finished film, but also added a lot of the finished film's more overtly violent moments. By crafting a few memorable crowd-pleasing set pieces, John Carpenter's reshoots made sure that Halloween 2 stayed relevant for audiences in 1981. It's unlikely that, to us now, anyone watching Halloween 2 would object to its violence, given how much more extreme horror films became in the years to follow it. In 1981, however, on-screen violence was a major issue, hotly debated by critics and censors alike, and Halloween 2 was drawn into that debate, even though it was scarcely on the same page as some of its contemporaries with its kills, with only the hot tub scalding sequence feeling anywhere close to being exploitative or needlessly sadistic. Considering this was one of the things for which Halloween 2 is most heavily criticised in 1981, it's frustrating to realise that so much of the initial reaction to Halloween 2 was coloured by the knee-jerk puritanical outrage of the period. But whilst critics were quick to seize upon Halloween 2's violence first, then tailor their arguments to suit their condemnation of it, one man who wasn't against the movie's violence was John Carpenter. As writer and co-director, Carpenter wasn't helpless in plotting the course of the sequel, yet he was still incredibly displeased with the end result. There was something more about Halloween 2 that got under John Carpenter's skin, something that neither critics nor fans initially comprehended when the movie was released. Of course, given the trouble surrounding its production and the changing nature of horror films in the early 1980s, it's easy to see why, creatively, Halloween 2 is a less than attractive prospect, adding to an already overburdened subgenre and potentially lessening the impact of one of the most highly regarded films of the previous decade. But we aren't viewing Halloween 2 as it was viewed when it was first released in 1981, so the argument that sequels of any kind shouldn't exist is basically just screaming into the wind at this point. The Halloween franchise is a thing, and we're okay with that. It doesn't lessen the impact of the original, because that's not how sequels work. In the original Halloween, Laurie and Michael aren't related, and I never once stopped to think about this particular plot point, because to do so is irrelevant to the story that film is telling. In Halloween 2, that's a plot point, so I accept it in that film and all subsequent films. The basic rule of thumb for all franchises is that no matter how bad a retcon is, it can never affect the quality of the original that is being retconned. Halloween 2 isn't less of a film because its ending was later revoked, any more than Part 1 was. There's a satisfying sense of tidiness to Halloween 2's ending, and that's exactly what the intention was, so in that respect it succeeds in ending this particular story. So of course John Carpenter wasn't keen on the idea of making Halloween 2, and if he hadn't been contractually obliged to, then chances are he may well never have done so. Yet he still wrote a script that turned his own enigmatic original into a two-act piece, providing an overall narrative with a more conventional structure. Carpenter may have thought that director Rick Rosenthal didn't have a feel for the material, but what he really meant was Rosenthal didn't have a feel for his material. Halloween was through and through a John Carpenter film, and Rick Rosenthal was trapped into trying to imitate Carpenter's style, which for a director receiving critical appreciation in the post-Halloween period of his career must have seemed less flattering than it did frustrating. For someone who had fought so hard for creative control over the original Halloween, seeing another director create a sequel who brought nothing but a slavish imitation of Carpenter's own style must have irked him. Whilst it's great as a viewer that both movies have a uniformity of style and tone, indeed it would seem immensely jarring if there was a sudden radical stylistic shift, given that Part 2 begins with footage lifted straight from the end of Part 1, it was a further step towards what we now consider an utter homogenization of studio films, where authorship of any kind is limited in general to casting choices and very occasional stylistic ticks. With the aid of Dean Cundy's cinematography, it wasn't difficult to bring a visual unity to Parts 1 and 2, but of course Halloween 2's Rick Rosenthal was rarely called upon by the film's multiple producers to do anything else but to try and look as Carpenter-esque as possible.
It doesn't take that much for me to take my clothes off, and I was ready, willing, and able.
For a director that even remotely valued their ability to make whatever films they wanted to, the idea of making a sequel like this must have been frustrating, robbing the directorial process of any creative impetus. But John Carpenter was never criticizing Rick Rosenthal or the script he wrote, or the film as a whole, but in the idea that something as creative and unique as Halloween could become commodified and turned into something soulless and corporate. Halloween 2 may be the sequel that should never have existed, but it works well as a sequel to the original because of how careful it is to fit into the world of the first film, rarely feeling intrusive or contrived. Even its most controversial plot point plays an astonishingly insignificant role in the action as a whole. Comparisons to the original are inevitable, but it's to Halloween 2's credit that it still fares well and establishes itself with a higher body count and a more aggressive, kinetic pacing that has Michael pursuing Laurie from the first minute of the film to nearly the last. That we care so much about these characters in this world is a testament to the original film, of course, but Part 2 uses the time saved in establishing its characters to good effect, cramming in as much mayhem and suspense as it can into its running time, aided by a revamped version of Carpenter's masterful soundtrack, which would kick off the tradition of seeing the main theme reinterpreted with each sequel to varying degrees of success. Some people even prefer Halloween 2 to Part 1, doubtless because it plays out far more as a slasher film than the original did. If you come to Halloween late, after having seen the Friday the 13th films or a large number of other post-Halloween imitators, then you may be used to more blood and more killings, and you might find the original a lot tamer in comparison. Halloween 2 plays far more with action tropes, and offers a more explosive ending than the ambiguously sinister ending of the first film, as well as more sustained scenes of stalk and slash. For my money, Halloween 2 is best enjoyed as a double bill with the original, because of how neatly the two films flow together, and once you know where it's going, you can appreciate details in Part 2 more and more each time you watch it. Like how the boy that's killed wearing an outfit that looks enough like Michael Myers' gear to get the poor bastard killed is Ben Tramer, as in Ben Tramer, the boy that Laurie Strode mentioned fancying in Part 1.
Well, you could ask Dick Baxter. He'd go out with you.
I'd rather go with Ben Tramer.
Ben Tramer? I knew it! So you do think about things like that, huh, Laurie?
Shut up.
He's cute! Ben Tramer!
Hunt?
Yeah, what is it, Craig?
Yeah, I'm worried about Bennett Tramer.
He isn't home yet.
Yeah, and he left the party at 10. It's only a little after 11, boys.
He was real drunk.
How old is he?
17. He had this stupid mask on.
All right, boys.
17. And wearing a mask.
Oh, God.
Maybe we should check his dental record.
So there you have it, Halloween 2, the film that wrote the rulebook for modern horror sequels and changed the Halloween films forever. A standout slasher and one of the best films in the franchise, as well as being one of the closest and most faithful sequels of all time. Halloween 2 may not have gained the critical appreciation of its forebear, but it's one of my favourites and was popular enough to get its own imitators, slasher films set in hospitals, over the next few years. Whilst the idea of the film was enough to terrify someone as self-consciously creative as John Carpenter, the truth of the matter is that his condemnation of the film offers actually nothing about the quality of the finished product, his reaction instead being to its very existence as the harbinger of vulgar, soulless creativity, a Stepford Wives type imitation of a genuinely unique and original film and its director's style. So as much as I hate to admit it, in this particular case, though I can see his point, I'm going to have to say it. John Carpenter is wrong about Halloween 2, and ironically, the more Halloween films get made, the more we can appreciate it as an organic and well-made sequel. For now though, Michael Myers was well and truly dead, and this time, John Carpenter was going to make absolutely sure that he never returned again, because that would have just been ridiculous.